Well, in Uganda, the military has been deployed on the streets of the capital, Kampala, to deter planned anti-corruption protests there. Soldiers and police are reported to have blocked all the roads leading to Parliament. Young Ugandans accuse the government of rampant corruption and human rights abuses. Police have banned all protests in the capital. Well, on the eve of these planned anti-government protests, Ugandan opposition leader Bobi posted online, saying that police had surrounded the headquarters of the National Unity Platform Party in Kampala, the opposition, blocking off roads and arresting its party members. He says the government fears the will of the people, and once their fear of the government fades, quote, they will lose their power over us. Well, Uganda's president, Yoweri Museveni, warned in a televised address on Saturday that protests will not be tolerated.
What right then do you have to seek to generate chaotic behavior? What right do you have? We are busy producing wealth. You are getting cheap food. Other people in the other parts of the world are starving. They are crying for hunger. And you here, you want to disturb us. You are playing with fire.
Well, let's bring in Mwenda. He's the managing director of The Independent, a news magazine based out of Uganda. He joins us now from Kampala. Andrew, when you hear that rhetoric from Museveni, warning protesters they're playing with fire, I know there's been no permits issued for these protests. How concerned are you about the government response today, especially given the deployment we've already seen on the streets?
I actually think that is more of the same. It is what I would have expected of President Museveni. I think that given the current protests in Kenya, he's very careful that if he allows such a protest to take place, it may lead to a wrong place. So it is better to prevent it from ever happening than to allow it to happen and have to bear the consequences.
Sure. You mentioned Kenya there. I've been curious about the timing of these protests. How much of this has been inspired by what's been happening over the border?
I think so. I think this protest in Uganda has been greatly inspired and it's imitating what is happening in Kenya. And even Uganda government's response itself is shaped by looking at what happened in Kenya. You see, the mobilization has been taking place for around about 1 month in Uganda, taking place on social media. So the government knew what was coming. When it looks across the border, they see that in Kenya, the government saw this movement mobilizing on social media and took no action to prevent it. And because they did not take action, they were overwhelmed by the demonstrations and the president was forced to reverse his decisions. Now in Uganda, government of Uganda is learning from Kenya and Ugandan protesters are also learning from Kenya. So they were mobilizing on social media, only that the government here, especially the president, has effective personal control of the core elements of the state, especially the armed forces. So he has deployed on every nook and cranny of the city to ensure that people don't march towards parliament. And also Ugandans know him, that when he has said don't play with fire, he means it. So very few would dare.
It's interesting the choices that the government has made in terms of their deployment, though. The police, I understand, have barricaded opposition headquarters, but Bobi Wine has also been very clear this protest movement is not being organised by the opposition, that it's a grassroots youth movement, as we saw in Kenya too. Can you explain where this came from?
I think it is government deployed at the NUP headquarters. It knows that NUP is not involved in this mobilization, but I'm sure they don't want to take chances because if you put yourself in the position of government, you would expect that NUP would want to take advantage of the situation. So the best way is to ensure that you don't take any chances, you don't allow any risks whatsoever. Remember, this is basically a military government that came to power through a protracted armed struggle. Governments like that, you see them in China, in Vietnam, in Rwanda, in Nicaragua. They have particular characteristics. They tend to fuse politics with security. They are very security sensitive, and therefore they do not give space for their opponents to organize and challenge them, especially to organize a demonstration in the city, because the city is what you'd call the center of gravity. You can easily topple a government through an insurrection in the city.
Well, speaking of toppling a government, I mean, this is primarily supposed to be about corruption. I was looking at some of the numbers. It's $2.7 billion lost to corruption every year. I see the House Speaker has been sanctioned for corruption by the UK and the United States. Obviously, corruption is deeply entrenched in Uganda, despite government promises to fight it. We've been saying this is a youth movement. What does the youth want done differently?
Well, I think that the capacity of the government of Uganda to deliver public goods and services effectively and efficiently has been greatly compromised by gross corruption and incompetence. And people in Uganda, especially in Kampala, are frustrated. The roads are full of potholes, the drainages are blocked. Even the contracts where people are constructing roads have ground to a halt. So the city is in a mess. When Ugandan youth get angry about the incapacity of government to deliver goods and services, public goods and services, you can understand where they're coming from. The other thing is that I think the government of Uganda is armed to the teeth to always counter these protests. I personally think that if I was an advisor to government, the best way of government to do is to try to improve its own performance in order to reduce the anger of the youth. But instead, I see government arming itself to the teeth to fight. The money they're spending on the army and the police to contain riots can actually be spent on improving the quality of life in Kampala. So I get the sense that they're shooting themselves in the foot.
Well, we'll certainly see what happens on the streets of Kampala today. Andrew Mwenda there, the managing director of The Independent, a news magazine based out of Kampala. Thank you for joining us, Andrew.
You're welcome.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.